Hello and welcome to the Feeling Good podcast. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and joining me here in the Murrieta studios is Dr. David Burns. Hi, David.
Hi, Fabrice.
Dr. David Burns has been a pioneer in the development of cognitive therapy, and he is the creator of the new team therapy. He is the author of Feeling Good, which has sold over 5 million copies in the United States and has been translated into over 20 languages. He is an emeritus adjunct clinical professor of psychiatry at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Okay, so today we are going to do one of our Ask David podcasts where we answer some messages and questions from our listeners. And so the first one is from Kim. And Kim tells us, I've been reading When Panic Attacks, which is one of your very popular books. And I'm halfway through the book, but I'm not sure if any of the stories are stories I can relate to. Most of these stories are people with awesome jobs and talents, and in some sense they can be taken as ungrateful or unappreciative of their life or for what they have accomplished. And so she asks, what about the lower class individuals who struggle with real problems and don't have answers that will result in feeling much better at the end of the downward arrow technique, which we haven't talked about, but maybe you can mention something about this. People that have valid reasons to be anxious and to have fears.
Well, that's a great question, and there is always a temptation to say my problems are real.
Yeah.
They're not caused by distortions in my thoughts. At my hospital in Philadelphia, I moved my offices to an inner city hospital because they had a medical office building that had some room to rent, so I moved over there. And I think I mentioned in an earlier podcast that the president of the hospital asked me to set up a kind of, at the time we were calling it cognitive therapy, department of psychiatry, because they had no department of psychiatry. And so we set up a program for the people living in that neighborhood. We treated everyone in groups, and I wrote a very simple treatment manual called 10 Days to Self-Esteem, which was essentially a kind of cognitive therapy written on the fourth grade level with just a few paragraphs in each chapter and certain exercises for people to do.
And you've turned that into a book, which I have.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And we ran thousands of patients through this program, treating everyone in groups. And it was the most successful program and the most rewarding program I've ever been associated with. A quarter of our patients couldn't read or write. Many of them were homeless people, and they didn't have a lot of resources of any kind, really, intellectual or economic or whatever. But they were so warm and so grateful that we had put this program together for them. My colleagues, who were much like the woman or the man who asked this question, said, "Oh, the people you're treating, they couldn't care about cognitive therapy or cognitive distortions or twisted thinking. All they want is a meal and a bed."
Yeah.
But it turned out to be just the opposite, and it was just a fabulous program. We simplified the language a little bit, so we wouldn't be using buzzwords, and just to make it understandable to the people. So instead of like all or nothing thinking, we called it black or white thinking. And we had posters, we had checkerboard to illustrate that, and a magnifying glass to illustrate magnification. But aside from that, it was very much the same. I can give you a couple examples of working with people who were up against pretty difficult
I always like your vignettes.
One was a girl who was in high school, but she was in the special education classes because she had severe physical and mental impairments. and her parents brought her for treatment because she was suicidal. And her story was that she had been getting all A's in her special education classes and working very hard, but she got angry with her teacher and refused to study for a health quiz, and then flunked the health quiz, and then became suicidal and brought her in. And as I was talking to her, I did this the same as with any other patient, just to say, what are the thoughts that are triggering your negative feelings? And she said she had the thought, I'm a failure, and I'll always be a failure in the future.
And our listener may say, well, she had some good reasons because she was in special ed.
Exactly. And the problem is if you were to buy into that somehow inevitable that she should be depressed, then it kind of condemns her to depression when you say it's your circumstances rather than your thoughts. And so I just use a technique with her that I've used with many patients called examine the evidence. And so I would say things to her like, and this was just the first time I sat down with her and said, now, you flunked the health quiz, is that true? And she said, yes, that's true. And so I said, what were you getting in your other classes before you flunked this quiz? She said, all A's. So I said, so the health quiz, that's the first one you flunked, is that right? And she says, yes. And so I said, so are you saying then that you've gotten all A's and one F, and now you'll continue to get all F's in the future? She said, yes, that's what I'm saying. I said, does that make sense? Because you got one F, you're going to get all F's in the future. She said, are you saying that just because I flunked this one quiz, it doesn't mean I'm going to flunk all of my quizzes? I said, yes, that's what I've been driving at. And she said, well, let me see if I get that. Are you saying because I flunked this one quiz, but I've had all other A's, that maybe it doesn't mean I'm going to keep getting A's or F's in the future?
Yeah.
I said, yeah, that's kind of what I've been hinting at. And she said, well, let me see if I get what you're saying. Are you saying that just because I got this one F, it doesn't mean I'm going to get all F's? And I said, that's kind of what I was hinting at. And she said, well, let me see if I get what you're saying. And
how long did you go?
About 40 times. And then toward the end of the session, she said, so you're saying I'm not going to be a failure in all of my trades in the future? I said, that's what I've been trying to tell you. She said, I feel much better now.
So repetition helps. Huh?
Yeah, it was. I had to simplify it for her, but it was exactly the same thing. It's not the circumstances of our life, but rather the thoughts.
Yeah.
And when you're depressed, it makes no difference if you're rich or poor, but if you're depressed, those thoughts are going to have distortions, and it's the distortions rather than the reality that creates depression. It might seem politically incorrect to say that, but it's also very liberating, because it means whatever the circumstances of your life, you're not required to be feeling the misery of depression and low self-esteem, and that you do have the capacity for joy and for relief from anxiety and fear. But certainly I don't mean to minimize the fact that throughout the world horrible things are going on in Syria, and people are being bombed and killed and lose their homes, and it's totally normal to have fear. That would be healthy fear. You don't need to treat that fear. The fear is going to keep you alive, and to feel devastation and loss. Those are normal human emotions. But depression and anxiety disorder is not ever caused by the reality of what's going on in our lives. Negative feelings can be healthy and appropriate, but depression and anxiety are not healthy or necessary emotions.
Okay.
And I can give another example, a dramatic one. Again, you'd have to help me remember. I might have given this in a podcast, but did we talk about the woman who was diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer?
I don't recall, but if neither of us can recall, maybe our listeners don't recall either. So why don't we tell it again?
Okay. It's the same issue. just like the fellow that we talked about who said, oh, if you're on a railroad track and the train's coming, you're going to feel anxious. And then we showed why that really isn't necessarily the case in an earlier podcast. But people often say to me in workshops, well, reality can cause depression. Like suppose someone is dying of cancer, and then they're certainly going to be inevitable that they'd feel depressed and anxious, and it would be the facts.
Stand to reason.
Yeah, and I was asked to see a woman in the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania early on in my career. Mm-hmm. A colleague said she was a beloved employee in the School of Medicine, kind of an administrator woman. We can call her Mary, and that she had been diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer and was quite depressed. And would I see her? And I said, I'd be very, very happy to. Now, Mary was a woman in her 40s. She had never married. She lived in a big house outside of Philadelphia, and she was caring for 3 of her relatives who had multiple sclerosis or other disabilities. She was helping them out. They were living in the same house. And she was a kind of just gentle, loving person, like to help like the surgical residents with their research or help the students with their problems. A very giving, loving kind of woman. And she went to her 6-month OB/GYN checkup, and the doctor noticed a mass in her pelvis and said, we want you to come into the hospital and have a biopsy. Mm-hmm. And then they did the biopsy, and it was ovarian cancer in a fairly advanced state. And they told her that you've got 3 years to live, but there's not going to be any effective treatment for this. And she was understandably devastated. And I saw her, about a week after the diagnosis was made, when they asked me if I would go and talk to her. It was easy to take her history because she was happy in all of her life up to the week before when she learned she had 3 years to live. I used to use the Beck Depression Inventory, and she was severely depressed. I use other shorter scales now, but that was the first one I used in clinical work. And then I asked her, would you like some help with your depression? And she said, absolutely. I said, well, if I could help you today, would you want help today? And she said, absolutely. And so I had, again, we'll talk about this more in future podcasts, but something called the Daily Mood Log, where you record the upsetting event and circle your emotions and say how strong they are, and then record your negative thoughts. And the upsetting event was learning that I have terminal ovarian cancer, and then she was depressed 100 and anxious 100. And she was also guilty and ashamed 100 and hopeless 100 and had all of these feelings. And I'm thinking to myself, now wait a minute, how can cancer cause you to feel guilty or ashamed? And so I was curious to see what are the thoughts that are triggering that. And she had 3 thoughts. 1, I'm letting my family down. Number 2, they can't exist without me. And number 3, it's my fault I got cancer. And she believed all of those 100%. Now, you ask yourself, we've had a recent reporting on the cognitive distortions.
Yes.
Are there any distortions in those thoughts, Fabrice?
Lots.
Yes. What are some of them?
Well, to begin with, there's all or nothing thinking.
Yep. How would that work? You're right.
Oh, just based on very scant evidence, she's concluding that she's a bad person, that she's responsible, that she's done the wrong thing.
Yeah.
She's obviously, this is amplified by the mental filtering. She does not see all the wonderful things that she's been doing.
Yeah, to help other people.
And discounting the positive.
Yeah, discounting the positive. It's mind reading too. I'm letting my family down. They're angry with me. They're pissed. They're feeling let down.
Yeah.
She doesn't have any evidence for that.
No.
And then it's my fault I got cancer. What distortion is that?
Well, this is both self-blame and there's some labeling there.
Yep. And also emotional reasoning. I feel guilty, so I must have done something bad.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let me look for the reason.
Yeah. So um, it was fairly easy for her to identify the distortions because I have them in a box right at the bottom of the daily mood log. And then I just used a technique called the double standard technique. And this capitalizes on the fact that so many of us, including people listening right now, have a double standard. When we screw up, we rip ourselves to shred mercilessly. Do you do that, Fabrice, ever? I do
Never.
Yeah. I do that to myself a lot. I always have, and yet, if you were talking to someone else with the same problem, who is just like you, you'd be reasonable and compassionate. That's the double standard. And when you use this technique, you try to see if the person would be willing to talk to themselves the way they talk to a dear friend. So the way I did it with Mary, I guess we're calling her Mary, right? Yeah. It's not her real name. I always disguise the identities of people to protect their confidentiality. I said, Mary, let's imagine now that there was a woman in the bed right next to you here in the hospital. And she looks a lot like you, kind of like your identical twin, and a long-lost identical twin, but another woman. Mm-hmm. And she has all of your strengths and all of your weaknesses. And like you, she has just been diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer. And, she's been helping several relatives. And, she's just like you. So I want you to turn to her now, Mary, and say to her, you're letting your family down. They can't exist without you. Mm-hmm. It's your fault you got cancer. Just turn right to her and say that. Now, she was in a private room, so this is just an imaginary.
Yeah.
So there was a long silence, and 15, 20 seconds went by, and then she looked at me and she said, well, Dr. Burns, I can't say that to another woman. I said, well, why not, Mary? And she said, because that would be cruel.
Yeah.
And so I said, so according to your value system, then you don't say cruel, mean things to human beings who are suffering. Is that true, Mary? And she said, that's absolutely true. I'm a very religious person, Dr. Burns. And I said, well, you seem to be violating your own value system because you're a human being, and yet you're talking to yourself that way. But before we change too fast, Mary, I have to ask you another question here. Isn't it written in the Bible that the truth shall make you free? And I didn't know for sure it was in the Bible. I was
we'll have to look that up.
I think it, but I'm not sure. And fortunately, she said, oh, yes, that's a biblical notion for sure. And I said, and how about you, Mary? Do you lie a lot? She said, no, I always tell the truth. And I said, well, now then turn to this woman and tell her these things, because you see, you wrote that each one is 100% true. So if they're true for you, they're true for her. She's just like you. So now tell her the truth now. Tell her you're letting your family down. Mm-hmm. They can't exist without you. It's your fault. You got cancer.
Yeah.
And then there was another long silence, and she looked up to me and she said, Dr. Burns, I still can't say those things. I said, well, why not, Mary? She says, because they're not true. I said, tell me why. Doesn't her family feel all let down because she's in the hospital? She says, no, that's rubbish. They love her. They feel grateful for what she's done for them. And I said, write that on the positive thought column. How much do you believe that? She said 100%. And she said they feel sad and concerned. They feel love for her.
Yeah.
100%. Now, how much do you believe the thought, I'm letting my family down? She said, I don't believe it. That went from 100 to 0. And I said, okay, but we know this next one is true. Tell her your family can't live without you. They can't go on without you. And she said, well, that's not true either. I said, well, why not, Mary? And she said, well, it's true that I'm helping them, but they have tremendous resources of their own. And they'll do just fine after I'm gone. I said, how much do you believe that? She said, 100%. I said, write that on the positive thought column. How much do you believe this negative thought? They can't exist without me. She said, 0. That sounds nutty. And I said, well, how about this one? Tell her it's your fault you got cancer. And she says, no, I can't tell her that either. I said, why not? She says, because we don't know the cause of ovarian cancer. The world's top scientists don't know. At least in those days, they didn't know. I think they still don't know for sure.
I guess not.
And she couldn't give herself cancer if she tried. And I said, how much do you believe that? She said 100. I put that in the right-hand column. Now, how much do you believe it's my fault I got cancer? She said 0.
That was quick.
Yeah, and it took about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
It was the first time I had met with her. I said, how are you feeling? She said, I'm feeling tremendous relief. And I said, take the depression test again. Her score went to 0. It was a complete recovery from depression. And the moral of this story is that it's our thoughts, not the circumstances of our lives that cause these horrible feelings. But it sounds shocking to people. That's why the Buddha had so much trouble selling people on this idea 2,500 years ago. It's just not the way we're used to thinking. I never saw Mary again as a patient, although I ran into her from time to time in the medical school, and I know the story of what happened, and her depression did not return, and she had 3 very good years. She felt happy, she felt productive, she felt lovable, and those were 3 wonderful years for her. Sadly, massive metastases developed 3 years later, pretty much on schedule, and she was admitted back to the hospital to die. And she had into cardiac failure and had some kind of cardiac event and died. But,
that's sad.
Yeah, and it's sad. And it's sad that the psychotherapy couldn't be powerful enough to make the cancer go away.
No, that's too bad. You need to develop a cancer model now.
Yeah, well, but I think it was great that the therapy was able to give her the gift of joy, and what a more important thing to have during those precious last months or years of your life to feel lovable, to feel connected to people, to feel joy, to wake up and say it's great to be alive and to feel worthwhile. What a great thing it is. And I think it's a wonderful message that no matter what the circumstances of your lives might be, that we all have that potential, if you're willing to develop joy and self-esteem. I would say, and now I'm doing a new trauma workshop around the United States, and I do live demonstrations. I ask for a volunteer from the audience of someone who's had a horrific trauma.
Yeah.
And we've had, recently I had a Vietnam veteran who was homicidal and suicidal, and had a horrible war trauma. We've had people who've been raped and beaten for 35 years.
Yeah.
Just on and on. And I would say there's no group of people that I have found easier to work with and quicker to respond. In pretty much every case, they've had a complete elimination of symptoms or near complete in a single therapy session. And again, the people the homeless people we worked with in Philadelphia, and the people with little circumstances, they were the easiest people to work with. And I think one reason is that they were warm and emotional, and they were grateful. The compassion was huge for them, along with the technology.
Yeah, well, thank you. That was a great story, and I think that hopefully this will answer Kim's question, and so thank you for that. This has been another episode of the Feeling Good podcast. For more information, visit Dr. Burns' website at feelinggood.com, where you will find the show notes for this podcast under the blog page, and where you can leave your comments and questions. The website has an abundance of resources for therapists as well as non-therapists, including books, workshops, a list of online training groups around the world, and much more. Theme music is Gypsy Jazz in Paris, 1935, composed and performed by Brett Van Donsel. I am your host, Fabrice Nye, and I invite you to join us next time for another episode of the Feeling Good podcast.